Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Um, my name is Jennifer Palter-Silliman, and I work for the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety. And today's webinar that you are joining is called Bringing Development Review into Safe Systems. But before we get started with the program for the day, I'm going to just go over a few notes and housekeeping details. So the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety is a USDOT funded university transportation center that is focused on accelerating progress in reducing transport injuries and fatalities by utilizing a systems approach to bring perspectives from planning, engineering, public health, data science, and robotics to the road safety field. We are one of two national centers with a designated research focus on transportation safety. And we bring together, through our work, we bring together staff, faculty, and students from different UNC departments, including the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, the Department of City and Regional Planning, and the School of Public Health. And we also have four other partner universities, and those are Duke University, Florida Atlantic University, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So again, just a few housekeeping details. So all participants are muted today. So the only people talking will be the presenters and the panelists. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box feature in Zoom to submit your questions. That's how we will be fielding all questions. Today's session is being recorded, and we will make the recording and the slides available later. So we will send out an email about that. And here's just a little helpful Zoom tip. Please choose the speaker view option at the top of your Zoom screen to optimize the screen of the current, or the view of the current speaker. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our presenter today. Our presenter will be Jessie Saginor, who is the, is the chair and professor of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida Atlantic University. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jessie.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just get set up real quickly. Okay. Everybody can see the right screen, right? Title slide?
We see your notes view, so you might want to change
really?
The slide. Yes.
It should have been switched.
If you
Okay, there.
Looks good.
Oh, better. All right. My apologies for that. Still trying to figure this out after over 2 years. Anyway, thanks everybody for taking time on your busy schedules. I'm trying to make the best use of it in the next 15 minutes. And the title of this presentation is Bringing Development Review into Safe Systems. But before I go on and get into the substance of the material, I have to thank some of the wonderful people I've gotten to work with, specifically two people on here, Tabitha Combs, as well as Seth Jeunesse. In addition, Wes Comfer and Eric Dumbaugh, my colleague at FAU, also worked on this as part of the project team. And I give you an overview in terms of the research questions and what this research tries to address from an applied perspective. First off, how's road user safety reflected in contemporary TIA practice? So the main thing is, where are we right now? And what's the best way to go forward to ideally where we would like to go? In terms of where we would like to go, that takes us to the second research question in terms of what barriers exist to making safety an integral outcome of development review. So in other words, based on how development review is now, a lot of times we don't consider safety as part of that process. And then third, what gaps exist in conventional TIA that allow for introduction of safety-related outcomes? And so in terms of how we try to pull everything together, we essentially used grounded theory analysis through interviews and transcripts of those interviews. And then my colleagues at UNC use a program called Envision, which is a qualitative program to analyze basically transcripts and pull out themes. And based on those themes, they were able to create a matrix that enabled us to do some causal loop diagramming, And I know that's a real jargony, so you're going to see an actual causal loop diagram in a couple of slides. And then the interpretation of what we discovered through these interviews, focus group study, is to look at a system archetypes framework to try to explain and put a pattern on the things that we learned through these interviews and focus groups. And then towards the end of this presentation, we really focus on developing a safe TIA approach, which is kind of the next phase of this research. So in terms of background, what a lot of you know, based on a lot of your backgrounds in firms that you might represent in your professional roles, you already know that TIA is this common tool for evaluating and mitigating congestion. But you also know that it's an imperfect process. And there are a variety of issues, whether it might be the discouragement of infill development or cars versus other modes of transportation, whether it's bike, pedestrian, or mass transit. So given that, we basically have a lot of energy that is essentially put into trying to figure out a better way to reflect the dynamic processes within TIA. So that's a great first step, but on the flip side, it's not necessarily the best, it's not necessarily evolving in a pretty elegant manner. And so in terms of the basis for some of the conclusions that are coming out of this presentation today, there were practitioner interviews, essentially 41 interviews that were conducted with practitioners, whether they were engineers or planners, in cities that had populations ranging from 13,000 to 1.1 million people. Then we also had developer focus groups, which were essentially organized with the help of the Southeast Florida Caribbean chapter of the Urban Land Institute. And for those focus groups, we were able to get 12 senior level developers that had hands-on experience in the development process and the TIA process time and again. So it wasn't just some new developer just starting out, but people that had decades or years of experience. Additionally, they had a combined development portfolio of over $6 billion in the Southeast United States. And so that generated a lot of information related to the dynamic process related to TIA, because we know that tends to be a static process. And the dynamic process is what we learned based on these practitioner interviews, as well as the developer focus groups. And so the themes from grounded theory, literature reviews, the matrix analysis from the transcripts with planners and engineers is basically, we came to the conclusion that professional judgment is what many people use to understand safety. And there's always this pressure to address concerns. So in terms of how do they address safety? Additionally, some perspectives might say that congestion mitigation is safety. Other people will say more traffic means less safety. So more cars on the road, possibly more accidents, more fatalities. Or you could have more frustrated drivers because of congestion issues. That could also mean less safety. A lot of times there's this reliance on crash history and a specific intersection, which may or may not be the best route to take because that doesn't necessarily predict the future. So then we looked at the role of site plan review and what role safety could play in the site plan review process. And if through a modified version or perspective of site plan review, we might be able to improve safety. And so we did all that, and we were able to come up with a causal loop diagram, which ideally is meant to reflect the dynamic nature of this interplay between developers, planners, and engineers. And so if you look at what you see in front of you, you've got the developer to the upper left side, and then you have the planner and engineer to the right. And so if you remove those, what you see is basically this dynamic process where in terms of you have the professionals that rely on their own judgment to improve safety. And that's what you're seeing on the right side of this, where B1 is essentially the immediate congestion relief based on adding more capacity to the roadways. In terms of R2 and R1, R1 is basically you have additional capacity. So what happens is you might also have an increase in crashes and injuries, which can then contribute to things like traffic jams and related congestion. R2 is another reinforcing feedback loop, which is basically you have these frustrated drivers that essentially communicate their frustration to transportation professionals, whether it's engineers, whether it's planners, could possibly be other politicians in the city. And the issue is, how do you improve safety when you're facing these types of issues? Now, on the developer side, you essentially have B2, and B2 is this balancing feedback loop. What's happening here is essentially, in terms of talking to developers, a lot of things that they discussed was the value of having pre-development meetings where you bring all the people, all the different departments from the city to the table and discuss issues. And what this does is it essentially enables you to have discussions around additional development goals that might not necessarily be captured in the static nature of TIA. So it's a way to get to some of the dynamic things that might not be in the static steps that are affiliated with the TIA. And so that essentially is what we came up with, is that you have these professional, I guess, issues to some extent, or professional judgment in terms of how best to incorporate safety in the TIA process, because a lot of times it's not really addressed. And so between the practitioner interviews and the focus groups with developers, we were able to tease out a lot of these things that aren't easily captured in a lot of the research or case studies that exist. And so it's important, sure, we have this elegant diagram, but then sort of the question that you might ask is, so what? What's the big takeaway from this? So the first thing is that we came across two essential archetypes of why we make the decisions we do as it relates to TIA. So one is, sometimes we might seek the wrong goal. This means that a combination of prior experience, engineering judgment, or crash history examination sometimes might lead professionals to equate congestion with danger. And so then the focus sometimes is congestion mitigation with safety improvements. So I might be seeking the wrong goal. On the other hand, we have this archetype of fixes that fail. And so this means that if you try to mitigate congestion, you might actually be generating more traffic. And people might look at more traffic as meaning less safety, but it can also create more traffic congestion, more driver frustration, road rage, things along those lines. And so these factors often push professionals to focus only on the congestion and not necessarily on safety. So in terms of the overall findings, the road user safety isn't really explicitly considered in TIA, whether you're talking to professionals or to developers. On the developer side, one of the things that we found was that if people perceive a development as being unsafe, then it impacts the marketability of that development. So safety, developers consider it for one of two reasons. Number one, it would result in a decrease in marketability, or number two, it could actually lead to an increase in lawsuits based on things that might occur in that development. So in terms of the developer side, that's one way road user safety is not explicitly considered. Additionally, other entrenched practices, models, tools, and prevailing belief systems basically prioritize level of service at the expense of safety. So sometimes it's the things that we can easily measure in terms of level of service, traffic counts, and a variety of those things, versus something like safety, which sometimes is very difficult to measure when you're trying to look forward as opposed to looking backward. And so the process up to this point is largely qualitative in terms of what we got from the focus groups, from the interviews. And so the goal is to take that qualitative process and try to come up with a dynamic approach to TIA that incorporates safety. And so this is the concept of developing safe TIA. And so when we looked at everything within the process related to development, redevelopment, and all of those things, one of the areas where it made sense was to look at the site plan review process as essentially being the entry point for road user safety. And so from the developer's perspective, I already touched on it briefly, but if it isn't safe or it isn't perceived by people to be safe, that's bad for business. Higher vacancy rates, lower rents, crime, whatever the case might be. One of the interesting things that come out of the focus groups is that they're actually open to implementing safety into the development if it is evidence-backed. So in other words, if the professional's experience is pretty extensive and they could say, look, here's what's going to happen if you develop it this way. you might want to incorporate this even if it's not necessarily required as part of the TIA process. Additionally, there's this ad hoc layering of safety requirements on top of congestion mitigation. So that can be somewhat unwelcome. The next major point is that clear standards and processes for assessing and addressing safety can actually lessen the burden on developers. So to some extent, developers aren't necessarily against implementing safety measures, especially if they know up front, because that lessens the burden in terms of as the project starts progressing. Additionally, it reduces the influence of developer regulator relationship history on safety outcomes. And then to some extent, the clear standards help circumvent any subjectivity that might come from professional judgment. So ideally, when you look at the whole process, you can see or come to this conclusion that site plan review is essentially a leverage point related to developers and the ability to introduce, assess, and improve safety outcomes through better land development much earlier in the process. And so the Safe TIA overview, in terms of the next phase of the project, obviously one of the goals is a reduction in fatal serious conflicts. That's essentially the core outcome measure moving forward. The goal is to ideally complement and eventually replace conventional TIA as we know it. And the best way to get there, ideally, is to focus on site plan to leverage developer agency and motivation in the process. In terms of the key parameters, this is where it gets a little bit difficult in terms of the next phase of this project, to make it straightforward, standardizable, and replicable. So just think about that in terms of the undertaking for the next phase of this research. Ideally, it's going to be backed by analytical frameworks that are derived from current safe systems research. More importantly, it's going to focus on conflict risk reduction rather than crash remediation. Ideally, it's going to be iterative and dynamic, as well as inclusive of full analytical footprints. In terms of acceptable risk, ideally local agencies have some level or some acceptable level of risk related to roadway deaths and or serious injuries, and the timeline for meeting associated risk reduction goals. So in terms of how this looks, establish an acceptable level of risk. Then you have project scoping and background. So once you have the scope, you collect background information about impact area, identify existing potential conflict points, and then calculate the baseline risk envelope. From there, the second, major step is evaluate the proposed changes. So this is identify changes to or new access points required for all modes related to transportation or traffic. Then identify potential conflict points and access barriers for all users. Calculate the risk envelope and modify access points, and calculate difference between baseline and revised risk envelopes. And then you essentially iterate and mitigate these things by adjusting the site plan to mitigate these risks to reach predetermined acceptable levels of risk of injury to road users. So the next step is basically to disseminate the Safe TIA framework, the first version / iteration for feedback, and then essentially to identify opportunities to actually find demonstration projects, development projects to apply, evaluate, and ideally possibly refine future versions of Safe TIA. And so that, in a nutshell, at 2:49, because I was told I had until 2:50, is the current research that is underway or hopefully nearing completion in the near future. And with that, we'll open it up to question and answer.
Thank you, Jesse. We don't have any questions in right now, but I'm sure they're going to start coming in really quickly and soon. And if you have any questions, please make sure to type them into the Q&A function. Or you may have provided such thorough information nobody has any questions.
Or everybody's asleep.
All right, here we go. We got a couple. Here they're coming in. Okay, so the first question, can you speak to how you would recruit, find opportunities to apply the refined Safe TIA process?
Yes, I think part of it is the fact that we do, real quickly, my background in like 2 sentences, I do a lot of real estate research and stuff. So that's the simplified version. So in terms of reaching out to developers and getting some case studies related to their developments, I think that's one goal. I know that a lot of my colleagues at UNC, we've discussed this a little bit. So that's essentially the route we plan to take.
All right, thank you. Another question. If you are looking for volunteers to assist with the work described, feel free to reach out. This is somebody just offering their themselves for that. So we will look into that later.
Okay.
What is the possibility of integrating TIA with road safety audits, which already have a framework?
I'll kick that over to my more transportation intelligent colleagues.
All right. So we have a couple of other people available to answer questions. So Tab Combs with UNC Department of City and Regional Planning.
Yeah, that's by the way, thanks Jesse for putting all of our work into a nutshell. That was really great. So the question about integrating TIA with road safety audits, I think is a really good one. I think, road safety audits are probably a very important piece of the puzzle, particularly in the beginning of the analysis as we've laid it out, or the proposed analysis. It parallels the trip gen analysis of conventional TIA, in that you are trying to document the existing conditions as best as possible. And so a road safety audit would certainly be appropriate in that phase of the analysis.
Thank you, Tab. All right. Another question is, can you offer any examples of where agencies have explicitly made LOS not a criterion, or said LOS, F as in the peak, is acceptable and in conflict with safety?
I can take a stab at that one. Well, I cannot take a stab at that one because I do know that there are examples, but I do not have them at the tip of my head right now. I'm sorry.
All right. So, okay, another question. Are there any case studies of cities or counties that could be held up as a noteworthy best practice to follow?
From a safety standpoint, not that we're aware of yet. We have done a lot of research trying to study and identify innovation and leaders in innovation and TIA practice more generally, and we found quite a few cities there. And so the previous research, it was on one of Jesse's earlier slides, it was linked to some of that previous research. But with respect to meaningfully incorporating safety, we actually have not yet seen that yet. Thank you, Jesse. So either of those 2 links will take you to some studies where we've looked at just innovation more generally in TIA. But in terms of incorporating safety and centering safety, we're not aware of any localities that have done that. Doesn't mean that they're not out there. We just haven't found them yet. If they're out there, hopefully they're watching and we'll pipe up.
Great. Okay. Lots of good questions coming in. Another one is this. So going back to the findings under the developers, am I correct in understanding that developers express their working relationship with local government planners, et cetera, as part of their willingness to listen and incorporated safety-related items into their development, so that relationships, communications is just as critical as any data back findings? That's a long question.
It is, but I can just say yes. But I'm just kidding. What was interesting was this, is that I'm looking at your question as I'm answering it, is that they just want to know to some extent what else that's not specifically in the TIA that cities would like them to do to enable the development to move forward from the first step. In other words, when we were interviewing, or when we had these focus groups, one of the interesting things the developers brought up is the fact that there were things that would pop up after they started the development. Let's call them unintended consequences of a development, which actually touches on another question of, if you're building a new development next to another new development, who deals with the generated traffic amongst both of those developments? So that was kind of a shortcoming, but that's more multi-development related. When it comes to specific development, most of the developers said if they knew on day one exactly what the people wanted, even if it's not explicitly mentioned as part of the TIA or site plan review process, they're more willing to do it on the front end than on the back end, because it might require them to change the footprint or to change entrances and ingress and egress and those types of things. So they are amenable. They just like to know up front.
All right. Moving on to another question. Thank you. How do you envision communities developing acceptable risk levels similar to acceptable LOS thresholds? Or how do you?
This is a bit of a philosophical question. I think, when you pin people down and say, what's the acceptable level of risk of fatality or injury? In the Vision Zero era, we would expect the answer to be zero. The hard part is figuring out what's the timeline for getting there. And realistically, maybe zero is not the answer in many places. But that is a hard conversation that agencies need to have themselves.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, they keep coming in. Another question. Let's see. For some infill developments, often the problem is that the developer doesn't want to be responsible for paying for existing roadway safety improvements that they argue the government should do. Are there any legal tools to require cooperation?
I mean, I would say to some extent, if it's part of the site plan review process and they want it done, then it will naturally be required. I know Florida has become a lot more rigorous in their legislation for this, I guess, a financial / legal nexus to impact fees. So it's becoming a lot more tightened in terms of the cities having to prove that development impact fees are specifically related to safety improvements on that property. So to some extent, the law is, in Florida at least, is a little bit more, I guess, beneficial to developers than cities in terms of the burden of proof on that.
All right. Let's see. The ITE, another question, the ITE recommended practice for multimodal traffic impact analysis is being updated and will include a lot more on safety compared to before. And so how do you envision that resource benefiting from your work and vice versa?
We've referenced that fairly heavily in the research that sort of underlies the development of this framework. And we're optimistic that they're referencing this work as well. Whether we can partner when we move forward to refine the framework is an open question, but I think it would be a really beneficial partnership to do so.
Okay. Let's see, I think we have time for one more question. And so here's the last question. Do you see that the focus of safety improvements would be on offsite safety changes identified by the TIA or safety changes internal to the site?
Both, either. It depends a lot on the site context. The framework, as we've scoped it out thus far, really identifies an area of impact in the same way the conventional TIA does. And so, conventional TIA may result in asking developers to do off-site mitigations for congestion or on-site mitigations, and the same thing would happen with the safety approach.
All right, well, thank you. I think that was the last question. So I want to thank both Jesse and for Tab Combs for pitching in on answering questions. So Jesse, if you don't mind going to the last slide, before we all sign off, I wanted to tell you about next month's webinar or online seminar in the series. It'll be held on October 26th, and the presenter will be UNC's own Becky Nauman from the UNC Injury Prevention Research Center, and she will be talking about, well, you can see the title right there, case studies from across the U.S. on using systems thinking tools to inform safe system partnership, strategic planning, and research. So again, thank you all for joining us today. We did get a couple questions asking if we were going to be sending out the slides. So yes, we will be sending out the slides and also a link to the recording. So stay tuned for that email. And thank you all for joining us today. And thank you again to our presenters.
All right. Thank you. It was a pleasure.